the director of the Office of Sustainability at Westchester University. And we are very pleased to have you join us today for a presentation by Professor Casey Bohrman in our Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. This is the 9th presentation this semester. We have one more 2 weeks from today. Next week, of course, is Thanksgiving break, so we'll take a pause for that. But please join us again on November 30th. Our office is proud to be able to sponsor this series. This is the 11th semester we have done this, and we have done it in collaboration with our colleagues from the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs and from the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. So thank you again for joining us today. And without further ado, let me pass the digital floor to Professor Casey Bohrman.
Hello, thank you so much to folks who are here. And I was saying to Dr. Flam that I didn't do a great job of necessarily promoting this today, but I'm really excited to give this talk and to kind of share it out later on. So I am Casey Bohrman, and I use she and her pronouns, and I am a professor in graduate social work. So let's see, I'm going to share my screen. So I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how I came to this work around transformative justice. My background is in social work, and particularly in social work around behavioral health systems and around the criminal legal system. And when I started my research career almost 20 years ago, I was really interested in prison systems and in the capacity of what I called at the time, criminal justice system to help people kind of reform. And so a lot of my research had focused on interventions that could help people successfully re-enter the community. I was always interested in community context and how it impacted it, but a lot of my research was really on kind of the work that we could do with individuals. And I had done some research also around policing and how police could better work with folks who have mental illnesses and substance use disorders. And I think through my research, and I want to give a big shout out to an undergraduate professor who played such a huge role kind of in my own personal transformation and in a lot of the ideas in this presentation, Dr. Meg Panicelli. And she's a faculty member in undergraduate social work. And she's really kind of helped me to progress my thinking around the limitations of the criminal legal system and the harms that can come about through that, even when we're well-intentioned and we want to focus on things like reform. And in particular, I think one of my interests is in the ways that harm can intersect with what's going on in communities. And so I want to say that this is not a place that came naturally for me. It came through a lot of work in thinking about how to create safer communities through more traditional kind of criminal justice structures, particularly around harm that can take place in communities. I think it's also important to acknowledge that I am a white, cis, middle-class woman, and that a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today have really come about through the work of advocacy, kind of activism work, and eventually scholarship of women of color. So a lot of my previous work had been around crime. And to some extent, I may still use crime and harm interchangeably, but I think it's really important to start off this discussion with a distinction about the ways in which they overlap and are perhaps kind of distinct concepts. So one of the, a class that I teach that Meg Panicelli and I co-developed is around transformative justice in the social work context. And our first assignment is to ask students to kind of define for us concepts like crime and harm and justice, and then to go back towards the end of the semester and look at kind of what those definitions are. And I think we often think about crime and harm as being synonymous. And certainly there are some activities that in the US and largely around the world are considered to be criminal, you know, such as, you know, assault, you know, murder, that no question cause harm. But there's certainly other activities that are labeled as criminal, such as sex work, that I think there's real questions around where the harm intersects there. And even more importantly, I think for this talk is that there are a lot of harmful behaviors that we don't necessarily consider to be criminal. And so therefore, the criminal legal system is really limited, I think, in dealing with all kinds of harm, but particularly those harms that we don't label as criminal. And so also what's important to acknowledge from this is that really crime is anything that a society decides is a crime. So it's very much dependent on historical and geographic context, what is considered criminal behavior. So today I'm going to focus on predominantly on that concept of harm. And a new kind of field that's come out recently is this idea of semiology. And it was developed by two sociologists, Hilliard and Toombs. And Hilliard defines semiology as a discipline that seeks to unearth harmful structures, policies, decisions, and practices, evidences the impact that they have, and thus generate sustainable and radical change so that they may be mitigated or eradicated. And really, this field came about as a critique of our traditional field of criminology that often looks at harm conflated with crime, and particularly on this individual level, and that really disguises the ways in which structures can often be some of the most harmful forces in our society. And so I want to acknowledge that and say that that's, while the focus of my talk today is going to be around interpersonal harm, that these social harms that aren't addressed at all by our criminal legal system often very much kind of underlie what comes about and on the surface looks just like interpersonal harms. And going back to that previous slide around harms, I think, again, you know, when things are done through the context of the government and, you know, thinking about this particularly in a context of the environment and environmental justice, right? We don't consider things to be a crime when, you know, the government engages in fracking or other, you know, or not engages in, but supports, or to some extent engages in behaviors that really cause a lot of environmental damage. Or, for example, if someone kills someone else, you know, people typically think, oh, of course that's a crime. But no, if you're in the military and you do it, or if you're in another context, then that's not necessarily a crime. And so there's so much harm that takes place outside of that, what we think about in a traditional kind of crime framework. So I'm going to focus on this concept of harm because I think it's a lot more specific than talking about crime. And it's something that I'm particularly concerned about. And so what I want to first talk about is how we currently deal with harms that take place in a society. So these could be physical harms, they could be psychological or financial harms, but these are kind of the interpersonal harms. So this is kind of an overview of what the main ways that we kind of deal with these harms today. So I think the predominant way that we deal with harm is to ignore it on a societal or community level, or we deal with it kind of individually. Often because harm is not recognized or it's not thought of as legitimate. And I think a lot about things like microaggressions or other types of harms that people experience through structural violence, or even, you know, the ways that we talk about people that is not considered harmful, especially if someone didn't have bad intentions behind it. A lot of times there's not a specific system to deal with a lot of the harms that we experience. Again, if something is you know, classified as a crime, we do have the criminal legal system, although in a lot of ways it's insufficient to deal with the harms that we have. So for example, in terms of sexual assault, most sexual assault goes unreported or never makes it to the criminal legal system because people don't feel like it's a sufficient way to kind of deal with it, or their concerns aren't taken seriously. Another reason that people might kind of try to ignore or deal with things individually is to prevent the harms that occur through working through the criminal legal system. So, you know, if you're harmed by your intimate partner, you may be worried that going to the criminal legal system actually is going to take things out of your control and harm your partner in ways that don't feel helpful to you. Additionally, sometimes engaging with the criminal legal system when you've been harmed can be traumatic in and of itself. Another big way that we deal with harm, particularly when it's classified as crime and it comes to the attention of the criminal legal system, is incarceration. And in criminological theory, when we think about how we deal with crime, we often call this kind of incapacitation. I think it's important to acknowledge that for interpersonal harm, sometimes incapacitation on an individual level can actually have positive effects. If you're in you know, a violent relationship, having that person kind of locked up, at least temporarily, provides perhaps temporary safety for you. So on an individual basis, there can be temporary benefits to incapacitation. The problem is that there's also, you know, clear harms, and I'll talk about that more in the next slide, that can come along with that incapacitation. And when we think about this on a community level, there are clear harms to communities. So even if on an individual level, removing someone from society, kind of preventing them, at least on the outside, because certainly they could harm other people within a prison, can reduce the likelihood that they're going to harm that person. Although what it also does is reduce the likelihood that they can provide support to their children, to their partners, to other family members. And when we think about that on a larger scale, where is incarceration taking place? It's taking place in what Massey and Denton have talked about as hyper-segregated neighborhoods. So even within, for example, Philadelphia, it's not the whole city that's impacted. Even though Philadelphia is disproportionately impacted by incarceration, it's not the whole city that's impacted. It's very concentrated neighborhoods and even blocks within those neighborhoods that are impacted. And so Clear and colleagues have come up with this idea about coercive mobility to really talk more about the ways in which communities are harmed when people are removed from a community. And the harm occurs both when people are removed because it creates instability, it takes away people's financial, emotional, other resources, but then it also creates instability when those people return. And if they've been incarcerated, they, you know, have probably experienced trauma in that incarceration. They're coming back with that, in addition to coming back, you know, oftentimes without financial resources, with challenges connecting to the labor market, along with so many other issues, and the brunt of that is being borne by those hyper-segregated communities. So incarceration can also be thought about as a form of punishment. So when we're thinking about harms and how we deal with it as a society, one way we deal with it is we say, all right, to prevent you from harming others, we're going to take you out of society completely. Another way is through punishment. And so the idea behind punishment is that if we have this punishment out there, we can deter people from committing crimes, and we can feel like there is some consequences for it. So there's these ideas of specific deterrence of, once you go to jail, then you don't like that experience, you never want to engage in that behavior again, or general deterrence of you see other people, being punished, and so by seeing them and what happens to them, then you're not wanting to engage in that behavior either. The problem with this idea is that really there is very little evidence suggesting that punishments actually deter crime. And so a lot of our focus historically has been around, does incarceration deter crime? Right now, we're actually seeing a decrease in incarceration, but we're still continuing to see increases in things like fines, community sanctions like probation and parole. And there's real questions, again, over whether that's actually going to reduce the likelihood that someone's going to engage in interpersonal harm. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems with punishing people for harming other people is that those individuals who often historically have themselves experienced harm, right? So the people that experience interpersonal harm that, for example, come to the attention of the criminal legal system, the folks who come as survivors or victims, that population has a lot of overlap with the population of people who come as the perpetrators of those behaviors. And so folks who are coming into our prison system, have already, probably experienced high levels of trauma, and then we're inducing further trauma and harm in increasing the likelihood that they're going to have health problems or all kinds of other things that in the end, if what we're invested in is having safer communities, we're exacerbating that, not working towards healthier and safer communities by removing people and putting them in these traumatic atmospheres. The big problem with both kind of dealing with things on an individual level, with incapacitation, with punishment, with this focus on deterrence, is that it's all focused on the perpetrator, the person who's engaged with that behavior. Our criminal legal system is so highly focused on the perpetrator that in fact, the person who has experienced the harm, in our criminal legal system isn't even acknowledged in a court case. We think about the harm as being against the state. So it's the state versus that person. The victim is completely taken out of the equation in it. In addition, if there is involvement, we see the victim as one sole person who's been, or perhaps there's been multiple victims, but we see it, usually in an individualized way. Restorative justice kind of expands our ideas of crime and harm to really think more about the ways in which, when interpersonal harm takes place, it's not just those two people involved that are impacted. It's families, it's communities, it's our society as a whole. I'm sorry about that. I have my Zoom here, so I've skipped to the next slide. The other big part of our criminal legal system is rehabilitation, right? Again, very much focused on the individual, not looking at how we can rehabilitate communities or other people who've been impacted. A big problem with rehabilitation as a sole focus is that you know, we don't really have great rehabilitation programs that show strong evidence for stopping people from going back into the criminal legal system. In part, that could be because of the funding that's dedicated, but in other parts, it's because harm doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so if we take somebody who's ended up in our prison system or on probation or parole, and we hook them up with, you know, mental health services or substance use services or other things that we think might be at the root of things, it's not addressing the fact that they're perhaps going back into violent communities, or that they, you know, that they don't have jobs, or you know, or other kind of structural factors that go beyond kind of this individual treatment. And so there's been a lot of intervention research that said, you know, these interventions look good on the surface, but then when we go to implement them in poorly resourced communities, they're actually not all that effective. Another problem with rehabilitation is that it's often coupled with punishment. So there's always this threat of, if you don't follow through with the rehabilitation, then you end up back into the criminal legal system. And what we see is that service systems that are supposed to be seen as helping actually can get co-opted by the criminal legal system and become more kind of punishing in their nature. And so a huge part of kind of coupling rehabilitation or dealing with people's underlying issues with the criminal legal system is that we start to become kind of have more of a punishment logic even in these systems that are supposed to help. So moving away from that individualized focus is this idea of restorative justice. And it's maybe in the last 30 years or so in the West been talked about as an approach to dealing with interpersonal violence, but it comes really from indigenous kind of beliefs, largely from kind of the Maori in New Zealand and indigenous populations in Australia. And a lot of the principles also very much relate to the ways in which indigenous populations in the US see folks as all interrelated, both with themselves and the environment. And so what restorative justice does is says when a harm occurs, it's not just between those two individuals. It's, you know, again, as I mentioned earlier, their families, their communities that are impacted. And so what it does is says when a harm has occurred, we need to figure out how to mend that relationship. And that might involve work with somebody who's labeled as the perpetrator, someone who's labeled as the victim. And again, this is a little bit controversial because it can water down this idea of victimhood, but we can see the idea of victim in restorative justice as a much broader context. So for example, you know, if somebody is sexually assaulted, it's not just them who's impacted, it's, you know, their family who's kind of taking care of them. It's, you know, other people around them who see themselves as potentially you know, liable to end up in a similar circumstance. And so what restorative justice says is we have to look at, you know, how to work with individuals, with those victims, and then what's been the impact on the larger community. What transformative justice is, and this is an idea that's really only come about in, I would say, the last 20 years or so, but it's this idea, it builds upon restorative justice. So a lot of the practitioners of transformative justice come out of a restorative justice tradition. And I myself had been very much kind of involved in restorative justice. I had worked with some folks who resided in what was Graterford, one of the prisons here in Pennsylvania, where there was a group in the prison of folks who were engaged in restorative justice work. And they were really focused on the people inside, the prisoners were mending relationships with families and thinking about this. And the critique of restorative justice is that it's trying to get relationships back to where they were. Transformative justice says, well, maybe that's not good enough. Maybe some of these relationships were problematic to start with and are cultures, our communities as a whole certainly, have these oppressive features that were there before. And if we're just looking to restoring things, then we're not addressing those underlying issues that also contribute to individual harm. So restorative justice really builds upon transformative justice really builds upon restorative justice. And I want to take a second to talk about this idea of community, because I've mentioned it here in restorative justice, and it becomes particularly important in the context of transformative justice. So I'm going to use a definition from Generation 5, who was, I don't believe that I'm not sure actually if they're any longer doing work. I don't believe they're active at the moment, but it's a transformative justice collective that's published some really great work around what transformative justice can look like. And they define community as a group of people in relationship based on common experience, identity, geography, values, beliefs, and/or politics. And I like this expansive idea of community that can really resonate for a lot of people, that don't just think about a geographic community, but also think about these things like communities of identity. So what is transformative justice? This definition comes from Mia Mingus, who is part of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and they're one of the few kind of real prominent nationally active transformative justice collectives. And she's really one of the main leaders around transformative justice. And she also looks a lot about the intersections between transformative justice and disability justice. And she says transformative justice is a political framework. It's an approach for responding to violence, harm, and abuse. And at its most basic, it seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence, which often the criminal legal system does, and engaging in harm reduction to lessen the violence. Transformative justice can be thought of as a way of making things right, or getting in right relationship, or creating justice together. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, transformative justice is this emergent theory that's come up very much out of the work of women of color, many of them working in intimate partner violence and seeing the harm that has come about through involvement in the criminal legal system, particularly for low income and/or Black and Brown communities that can be overly surveilled by these systems and overly penalized by them. And so they were really looking for, we've got this violence that can't just be dealt with individually. What are alternatives to the criminal legal system? And this idea of transformative justice has really emerged. And again, it focuses on how do we take this beyond just two individuals and look at community accountability? So Generation 5 has laid out these 5 principles of transformative justice. And one of the interesting things is, when I put this idea out as a talk, I didn't even realize that this is actually, sustainability is actually this core principle of transformative justice according to Generation 5. And they talk about in their seminal document around transformative justice, why do we need sustainability in transformative justice? It's because no change, and my social work colleagues that are here will very much kind of feel this change, whether it's at an individual level and particularly at a structural level, it doesn't come about easily. It takes a long-term investment and commitment. It requires human, financial, emotional, political, and financial resources. And so it's crucial in these processes that we think about, how can we be in this for the long haul? Because there's not going to be some quick intervention that's going to really make a difference at an individual level, or certainly at a community level. So I've talked about why does transformative justice require sustainability, but also why do sustainable communities require transformative justice? And one of the main things that I think a lot about is the fact when people engage in harm, particularly egregious harm, I think our gut is often to be like, we got to get these people out of here. And the lesson we've learned from the criminal legal system is that we can only remove people for so long, and then they're coming back. But also that process of removing them is, perhaps not, especially through the criminal legal system, maybe just not possible, not helpful. So, if we've got a community where there's going to be people there who engage in harm, and we all engage in harm in different ways, how do we figure out ways to reduce the likelihood of that harm through working with individuals and with transforming the community as a whole? When you go and you look at the sustainability goals in under the UN, so many of them get at how we can reduce the likelihood that people engage in interpersonal harm. So when we look at things like poverty, hunger, well-being, education, gender equality, so many of those systematic issues underlie why people engage in this interpersonal harm. And so if we want to reduce interpersonal harm in our communities, we have to get at some of these sustainability goals around all of those and reducing inequality. The thing I'm going to focus on from here out is the sustainability goal around peace, justice, and strengthening institutions. So what could this look like? So I'm going to give kind of some local examples. So one of the national examples that I was not involved in, and again, Meg Panichelli, who has been such a driver of my thinking around so much of this. I just want to make sure to really give her intellectual credit for this. Was involved in this to some extent, but was a group historically, they're not in operation anymore. There were two kind of groups that worked together. The first was Philly Stands Up, and then out of that formed Philly's Pissed. And they're a transformative justice collective, and they primarily worked with the queer and/or radical and/or punk communities. This is kind of their language. And the idea with transformative justice is that it has to occur on a local community level with people from that community. And so the reason they work with that community is those were the people that got involved. Transformative justice won't work with people from outside of a community kind of coming in and trying to impose ideas and solutions on a group. So this group particularly focused on sexual assault. One group focused on perpetrators, and that was the initial group. And what happened with that group was that there were some people that burnt out. They could not do that work long term. And there was a recognition that in addition to helping people who engage in harm change, there also needed to be a lot of attention placed on supporting people who've been victimized. And so the second group, Philly's Pissed, emerged to really support survivors. And one of the things that they're very clear about is that, and I think they're particularly attentive to this because of the large number of people from the queer community, but they're really clear that the groups were not divided along gendered lines. So there were people from all genders in both the people working with perpetrators and the people working with survivors. And the people identifying as perpetrators also span the gender spectrum. So how the group that was working specifically with the perpetrators of violence were doing this work is they were working with the person to accept the harm that they've caused, to recognize how it's shown up in patterns, and then they work to create strategies for changing those patterns. And the thing that's really important in transformative justice, and I think to some extent is true in restorative justice as well, although restorative justice has been very much institutionalized and the voluntary nature of it has been removed, and I think has really complicated the processes of restorative justice. But transformative justice has to be voluntary. So the people coming to this restorative justice, this transformative justice collective were people who were self-identifying or maybe were referred by other people. But if people aren't able to take any form of accountability, then then a transformative justice can't work with them as the perpetrator. They could still serve the victims. So this is kind of, I want to share this because this is kind of what's held up as one of the national examples, but then I want to share some efforts that I've been involved in that haven't branded themselves as transformative justice, or one effort in particular, but I think is really a true example of what transformative justice can look like. So folks who, my couple of friends who've joined today know that in addition to being a social worker, another core part of my identity is being involved in the Muay Thai community. I've been involved in some capacity for over 20 years. For a while before kids, I was a fighter. I've been a coach, a ref, a judge. And so the Muay Thai community is something that's very important to me. And for those that aren't familiar with Muay Thai, it's a form of kickboxing that involves punching, kicks, knees, and elbows. And it's similar to boxing in that you win the fight either through inflicting the most harm or by knocking someone else out. And what's also important to understand about this community, so clearly within a sports context, violence is kind of endemic in this community in a controlled fashion. But I think what's also important, and what people outside of Muay Thai may not be familiar with, is this idea of green lighting. So at a gym, you know, when there's a newer person that's come and people have kind of beat up on them, or if there have been men that have, or people get too cocky, or men beat up on women, what you see in gyms is something called green lighting. And so the coach themselves, or they'll kind of tell someone else from the gym to put that person in check. And so the idea is that in order to bring that person's cockiness down, or to punish them, or to get them from continuing to kind of inflict harm upon people who are perceived as weaker, you go in and you beat that person up in a sparring context. And a lot of times that's through things like body shots, or things where you know it's going to cause a lot of pain, but it's not going to inflict kind of permanent harm usually. But sometimes, you know, it's people going in and like knocking people out, and it's a not well talked about, but fairly widespread practice within Muay Thai and other combat sports. The other important context to understand in Muay Thai that you probably all could guess is that it's very much a male-dominated sport in fighting, but it's also, particularly if you look at who are the gym owners, who are most of the refs, who are most of the officials, who are the heads of the sanctioning bodies. And another dynamic that's common, and I don't think this is all that different from Muay Thai, but the potential violent nature of our community can make this complicated, is that many women get involved with other fighters, or female fighters will date coaches. And that's a complicated power dynamic there. So I recently got married to my partner in a Muay Thai ring, who was not my coach, but was somebody that I met kind of through the gym. And I think that's true for a lot of women who are fighters or are very much invested in the community. But prior to him, I was dating on and off a cis man who had engaged in a lot of harm, emotional harm to me, but physical harm to other women, and to large numbers of women, both inside and outside the community. And this went on for years and years. And he's somebody in Philadelphia who's a gym owner, who's a referee, who's a judge, who's a professional fighter. And I would say maybe about 2 years ago, women started speaking up about this. And first they started connecting with one another to say, this is going on, and I know you're someone who dated him. And we started providing support to one another. We started posting on social media to be really public, because a lot of people, particularly men in the sport, were not aware of the harms that he's engaged in. And so what and then what other people were doing was thinking about how do we create safe spaces or safer spaces in other gyms where women who've either been at his gym or been around him can go and can feel safe and can know that these dynamics are not going to happen. One of the reasons I mentioned green lighting is that one of the ways that this man would physically abuse people is he would be the coach. And there's repeated accounts of women who were dating him where they kind of stood up to him and he said, I'm your trainer, you have to respect me. And he would beat people up in the gym in the context of green lighting, but it was very much conflated with these, intimate relationships that he had with them. So, so there was this effort for victims to come together to provide support, to provide safe spaces. There was some efforts on the part, particularly of men. I think this was one area where it was important for there to be a somewhat gendered approach to this. There was a lot of men that reached out to him. And, at one point when the social media stuff was going on, he talked about thinking of killing himself. And so people really reached out, tried to help him both around his mental health and to take accountability, but he has not engaged with any of those folks. And so I talked about, or he's engaged on a very surface level. And so I talked about earlier that removing people permanently from a community is not possible. And so this person is still in our community, but I do think, and this is within the framework of transformative justice, sometimes there has to be temporary ways of, not as a punishment, but of keeping people safe, of removing perpetrators from certain situations, at least until they're ready to take accountability and make change. So I was involved with a number of other women in contacting sanctioning bodies and asking them not to have him as a ref or an official anymore. And they all have cooperated because, women fighters would see him, and it would, it was so hard to get in and fight when the judge, is somebody who was your abuser. I had an incident where I was the only, in a huge tournament, he was there as a ref, and I was the only woman involved, and I had to go around and help the head official kind of move him from ring to ring because people were coming up to me and saying, he can't be in my fighter's ring. He can't be in my fighter's ring. And so what that has also prompted me to get involved in is to get more women involved in reffing and judging, and that, that it can't just fall on it. So much of it fell on me that I realized I needed other people, certainly other male allies, but I needed other women that were involved in these activities. And I've also started discussions around green lighting because I think they promote violence in the community, even if it's not between people who are dating. So something I'm thinking about a lot, and that I might end kind of a little bit early because I'd love to have some discussion with folks, is what could this look like in social work? One of the things that we do in social work is we gatekeep because our folks work with very vulnerable people. And so sometimes when people engage in egregious harm, especially in a social work program, we think about how do we get them out of this program? But the problem is they can go to another program, or they can still engage in social services, but not call themselves a social worker. And if they have privilege, they could fight back. They could sue our program for unfairly targeting them. And so, and removing them also doesn't get at what are perhaps some of the underlying reasons that this person is causing harm in the first place. So I've been very interested in thinking more about what transformative justice might look like for perpetrators, for victims, for communities. How do we address the incident and underlying factors? And one of the benefits of being very last minute in putting this all together is this past weekend, we had a social work conference, the big social work conference for social work educators. And this is some tweets from an incident that happened where an assistant professor was targeting and harassing some other assistant professors, but other doctoral students, trying to get them to come to his room, being persistent, even though people were saying they didn't want to be involved. They were continuing to see him at the conference. They went to the conference officials. People were not taking it seriously. And so there's been some interesting work that I've been seeing on social media, some calls for reform within our conference around how sexual assault is treated when it happens, what we can do to prevent it. I want to end with a quote from Generation 5 that in the face of devastation and urgency caused by violence in our lives, it can be difficult to do work in ways that are sustainable. However, I believe the work itself can be sustainable if we build support, sorry, there's a typo there, through collective action with the vision of immediate safety and transformation over time. And there are my references.
Thank you so much, Professor Bohrman. It's close to 12:50, and sometimes people need to step off at this point to get ready for another class. But if you have time for a discussion, I invite everyone who can to stay on. And Casey, do you have a preference for how questions are posed? People unmute themselves?
I'm not, because I couldn't see while the presentation was going on. So I just want to acknowledge, because she's here, that Meg, I'm not sure if you heard this, but I really from the beginning was talking about how so much of my thinking around this, for this presentation in particular, my understanding of transformative justice, I just want to give you a lot of intellectual credit for kind of the work that this presentation and the work that I'm doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think a lot of it comes from our collaborations and what we generate. And I think that's exactly in the spirit of transformative justice.
So yeah, I'm happy to questions, comments, whatever, folks.
Oh wait, someone's coming up. I think someone coming to ask a question. Okay.
Yeah, how's it going? Thank you for a really great, I really enjoyed that. And my question is twofold. One, I guess I would be curious to know your thoughts on the prison abolition movement and how that connects to this concept of transformative justice. And then I think the bigger question is, are we able to accomplish what you described as transformative justice within the current framework that we have? But I'd be curious to know your thoughts on the movement, to abolish the prison industrial complex that currently exists. And then another, well, I'll stop there because that's a good enough question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I think it's funny. I think when you're in stuff, there's things that feel so self-evident that you're not explicit about them. But this is very much grounded in the abolitionist tradition. And oftentimes people kind of talk about the ideas interchangeably because transformative justice, I think, inherently has to happen outside of, and I think it is almost difficult to talk about what the differences are. I think perhaps transformative justice is a path forward from this idea of abolishing systems. But I think a misconception around abolition in itself as a concept is that it's purely about destruction, because I think abolition is also about building, and abolition is about the fact that we couldn't today. I think it's often seen as a unrealistic dream, because sure, we couldn't just suddenly get rid of all police, suddenly get rid of prisons. We also need to build communities where people can be safe, where their needs can be met, where it reduces the likelihood that they engage in harm. So I think both transformative justice and the principle of abolition are about, how do we deal with harms and change societal structures that are ultimately the biggest drivers of those harms. I don't know, Meg, again, since Meg is here, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, I think I just wanted to say, similar to what you said, I think there's often this question about if we abolish prisons, what do we put in their place, or what will take care of the, you probably addressed this early on, but like what will, who will take care of the murderers and the psychopaths, or like the people who are serial killers. And so what's the replacement? But I think you say, like you asking the question, how do we sustain communities with transformative justice? Is that what you said? And then the opposite, how does transformative justice sustain communities? It's like we have to have that commitment, and we have to keep trying out new things. And I think Miriam Cabo, who's big in transformative justice and prison abolition, has a website called, I think it's called like 1 Million Experiments. And so different transformative justice projects and interventions and community experiments that are happening around the country, a lot of them are listed on the site. And it's just a really helpful way of thinking through, like, no, I can't tell you one solution to abolishing prisons, but there are a million solutions for how we like transform our communities or transform our commitments, and how that is how we keep ourselves outside the legal system, and don't cause farther harm in the lives of the most vulnerable in our communities.
Mia, did you unmute? No, okay. No pressure. I saw you. Someone else.
I was typing something in the chat, so maybe you could sense it.
Maybe.
I was just, I mean, I feel like I'm processing. I feel like this was really helpful. And I know that this is an area that you're passionate about and you have expertise. So I really appreciate your generosity in sharing that with us. And I was also thinking about the personal examples, kind of making it concrete too, because sometimes I think that these things for me can be a little heady. And so I appreciate you saying, like, this is what it looked like in my community and how we handled it. And it's very helpful. And I'm sorry, of course, that you all have had to go through that, and very cool that you're coming together, like as a community to deal with that too. The zemiology, I hadn't heard of that before. So I definitely want to look on that. And you said that it was the study of social harms. And is it specific to like the carceral system or in general?
No, actually it doesn't. It's much more so, and this zemiology gets into a lot around environmental justice, because it's very much around the ways in which social structures cause harms. So it's kind of a rejection of the focus so much on interpersonal harms, and more looking at the ways, the hidden ways that hidden in that they're not talked about as like crimes, hidden ways that society, that structures and governments cause harms.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I had oh, go ahead, Claire.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Brad. All right, so I'm not sure I'm going to ask this well because it's still in my head, like Mia. So I'm always thinking about the relational component, right, and the relational justice, right, and so I'm trying to figure out, how do we stop the us them thinking, right, the all or nothing kind of thinking that goes on in our communities. And I like that you talked about how this work sometimes has to be done within specific communities, because you kind of need to be a part of that, right? I was thinking about the accountability, and also like a relational intersectionality, right? That we are all both oppressors and oppressed, right? We're the microaggressors and the microaggressed. And so I'm not sure how that fits with your specific focus here, but just trying to, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are about that and how it relates, and this kind of sense of moving towards, I don't know, this relational justice, this kind of intersectional relationship.
I love it. I think this is something that Meg and I think and talk about a lot, that it's not always clear, even in an individual situation, who's the victim, who's the perpetrator. Things can sometimes get murky there. But and that's maybe a controversial thing to say in certain communities. But I was even thinking, and I thought about using this example, but it felt, I wasn't sure how to describe, I wasn't sure how to do this in a FERPA consistent way around work that I did with a student that engaged in harm, but was also really clear about the ways that he felt he was harmed. And I think, right, like, so being a student in different, like, that is inherently like somewhat of a, a lower power position, whether you're in the field or in the classroom. And so, when I looked at him as someone who had done harm, I was really looking at, some of his other identities that tend to be, and identities that are associated with more power. But then there's these other identities in which the person who was kind of victimized actually had more power over him. And so I think this is all complicated. I think in all of these examples, what we see is the work with victims and the work around structural change, like, while not easy, feels like a little bit more straightforward and successful. I feel like whether it's Billy's Pissed or my example, like, the work with people who are engaging in harm, I feel like that's the part that still feels like super unclear, like how to do that well. Because a lot of people don't, a lot of the people, and most harmful people, may not even admit that they're engaging in harm. And then, yeah.
I don't think our society does a good job with things like forgiveness and, moving forward, so that you're not like, once you have that criminal record, it's there, right? We're not good at releasing people, releasing for new life.
Totally. Yeah, and I think that's why I try to put, like, in quotes around getting this guy to the sanctioning bodies. Like, I don't want him removed from the community as a whole. I want him to make changes and for people to feel safer, and so that we can have him, involved in this stuff. Sorry. Okay, Brad, I know we're at time. I don't want to, anybody who wants to continue these conversations, there's so much, like, I think about a lot and I would love to talk more about.
I just have one last, Brad, is it all right if I ask one more question?
Go ahead.
I'm fine with that.
If that's okay. Just like one specific example that came to mind during your presentation, and the whole concept of, a boxing ring and that whole thing, I guess, thinking about people experiencing restorative justice or feeling that restorative justice, what that might feel like is, this might seem out there, but I'm just going to throw it out there. As one example of what it could look like is, imagine being in a ring with someone who has inflicted harm and someone who has experienced harm. That would be facilitated in a safe way with referees and that kind of thing, where, like, the person who was the victim, as it's called, had a chance to actually go round for round with the person that had inflicted that harm. I don't know if that's really the best way to go about things, but it's just something that came to my mind during the presentation. I just wanted to throw it out there as like as an undergraduate student who has this half-baked idea of what it could look like. That's basically just throwing it out there. So there you go.
I like that you say that, because a lot of abolitionists have nonviolence, and nonviolence is kind of a complicated idea anyway. But that's a very centric part of what they're doing. But transformative justice is not, like, the idea of violence is not fully removed from transformative justice, right? Like, so Meg, I think, has talked, and you could correct me if I'm wrong because you're more familiar, but Philly's pissed. Some of the things that they would entertain was like, I'm like going on the record about this. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying that this is an approach, right? Maybe you can talk for a second, Meg.
I think that there might have been like, if it's about, I think initially it started out as like, what does the survivor want to feel justice? And so sometimes they were like, I don't need to go beat my boyfriend up. And that happened. And they also moved away from that. Like, I think that like they didn't stay in that model. I mean, they weren't like, yes, we'll do all this like vandalism or violence. But I think initially it was really grassroots. Like, what do you need to feel safe? This is what I think I need to feel safe. We are going to help you feel safe. That was like the one group. And then I think from there, the Philly Stands Up, really started thinking about how can we really support behavior change and people like being accountable.
I think we have one more question here in the room. Did you want to?
Yes. Yeah, my question, as I was listening to the conversation, I was very curious. Like, I've heard of like in Germany where people, when they serve their prison sentences, they have like freedom of movement in the prison, and then like in the wider community. And I was just curious as to your comments, like how that would work in like an urban setting like Philadelphia versus like a rural setting and like a rural prison out in the Midwest.
Yeah, I guess even when you have like freedom of movement, there's still like the surveillance. There's often still the threat that you're going back into prisons. And it's also like who gets caught up in the prisons, right? Like, so a lot of the folks who are doing some of the most harm because of the way our criminal legal system is structured, like never end up in the criminal legal system. So I think it's really hard for me. I think I was very much in the place that you're in, and I'm not saying like that one is better, I'm like more evolved, but I think for a while I was very focused on like, how do we make prisons more humane? Like, how do we really create a rehabilitative atmosphere? Because it felt like that was the only way to reduce harm in communities. But I think I'm in a place where I guess that's not where I spend my energy, and I'm not sure that prisons can be reformed. But I think it's like a helpful question to ask, if that makes sense.
We are at 1:05. I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to, I'll just raise one of them now, and perhaps Casey, we can talk more later. But I was really curious at my reaction to the definition of community that's used, that really focuses on people, which makes perfect sense. But many scholars and other people, indigenous and from other cultures, think about community in terms of a wider community of living creatures in different ways. And I've been thinking a little bit about the concept of harm and the harms that we as humans do to our natural systems, upon which we depend in many ways, in most ways. And I just, there's no question, but it's more just a comment about how I'm thinking about how you've presented this idea of transformative justice in the context of the sustainability work we do in terms of environmental, social, and economic.
Totally. Yeah. I think it's not a complete definition, particularly if we're thinking about the context both of harm and the ways that things contribute to the community. So I think I was very much immersed in the transformative justice literature and looking kind of how they talked about community. But I think there's people who are really focused on that as a specific topic, that are thinking about it much more comprehensively. And so in the future, if I was to do this again, I like that idea of kind of expanding it. I do think it's incomplete.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating presentation. Lots of ideas, I think, for all of us who are fortunate enough to be here to keep thinking on. So one last thank you to you for making time to share your research, and thank you to everyone who has logged on or is there in person in Psych Student Union today. Just one last plug. Yes, clapping, virtual and real. One last presentation in the Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar 2 weeks from today, if you're able to join us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Bye, thank you.